3rd of December 2016. It's the first day of the PlayStation experience in Anaheim, California. Uncharted: The Lost Legacy has been revealed, with a follow-up panel to discuss the future and direction of this next standalone installment. As the day progresses and panels and demonstrations conclude, an eager crowd awaits the closing showcase. The lights dim, and all eyes turn to the screen. The video opens with a saturated shot of forestry, a wooded grove luscious and overgrown. The camera begins to slowly pull back. We cut to an abandoned car long since left to the elements. Another cut, and we're in a clearly abandoned village, the houses in ruins and wreathed in vegetation. Then, 37 seconds into the video, we cut to an old, rusted road sign. Daubed upon it is the Firefly's logo.
Just listen to the music, it's already giving it away.
The final title card announces The Last of Us Part 2, 3.5 years after the release of its predecessor. Trying to untangle my thoughts on this game has been difficult. On the one hand, mechanically, visually and performance-wise, it is undeniably superior to its predecessor. On the other, it suffers from many deep flaws that quick patches could never fix. I both enjoyed and did not enjoy the game in equal measure and was left conflicted, dissatisfied and confused, but not necessarily disappointed. So to preface this, I'm going to start by explaining my thoughts on both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 in the simplest, most unambitious manner I can muster. The Last of Us is a mediocre game with an excellent story, whereas The Last of Us Part 2 is a great game with a mediocre story. Now, when I say that The Last of Us has an excellent story, that's definitely at odds with what I said in my original video about the story being simple and predictable, so let me clarify. When I say excellent, I'm referring to the fact that whilst it is a fairly simple story, it is well told, well acted and engaging. Its pacing and structure is handled almost perfectly, and while some situations could have been done better, in my opinion, overall this is a highly positive experience that perfectly captures how it feels to be a morally ambiguous man slowly coming to terms with the loss of his daughter, and learning to let himself feel again. I'll link my video in the description for anyone interested. There was talk around the time that The Last of Us was released about the video game being the equivalent of Oscar bait, so it's therefore rather appropriate that it has a traditional 3-act structure. You tend to find this with the overwhelming majority of media that isn't trying to be overly stylised or artsy. Your 3-act structure is as follows. Act 1 is your setup, typically reserved for 2 things, which are exposition to get the audience comfortable with your characters and the catalyst or inciting incident for your story. This is often a dramatic situation that forces the protagonist to confront something terrible, case in point, the outbreak of the cordyceps virus and Sarah's subsequent death. Act 2 is your longest section of the narrative, taking up roughly the same length of time as the first and third acts combined. This is where the majority of the action takes place, where the protagonist learns the truth about the problem and the best way to solve it, if they can. Then you have the third act, which is where your protagonist gathers the resources they have acquired and confronts the nebulous evil, destroying it once and for all. By the end of the 3 acts, your character or characters will have learnt and grown as individuals and will have arrived at a new sense of self with a strong understanding of who they are and what they are capable of. This is why many movies, especially those made by Disney and similar animation studios, are often rarely any longer than 90 minutes. 90 minutes is the perfect time frame for a 3-act structure. You have a 15 to 20 minute setup for Act 1, 45 to 50 minutes for the second act, and the final 15 to 20 minutes for your resolution. The structure is so common because it works. It allows for easily digestible bits of information, confrontation and resolution without viewers needing to work too hard to understand what they're seeing. But when it comes to video games, extra time has to be made available, which means that whilst you can play fast and loose with your narrative structure, you still need to be able to be cohesive enough to keep your players engaged with the plot. A lot of games do this very well, and especially those that are heavily focused on their narrative rather than their mechanics. In fact, many games even specifically refer to each section of their narrative as acts to ensure that the player understands that there is an ongoing escalation as they progress. Ghost of Tsushima does this excellently, with the end of Act 1 showing Jin confronting the Mongols to rescue his uncle, only to realise that the fight to defeat the invaders has only barely begun. At the same time, he must come to terms with the bending and breaking of his samurai code, a recurring motif that is fully realised by the end of the second act. Similarly, CDPR's The Witcher 3 very notably draws attention to its structure, with Act 1 introducing the characters and the conflict, Act 2 carrying the search for and rescue of Ciri, and Act 3 concluding the overarching plot of defeating the Wild Hunt. Other games that follow this typical 3-act structure but don't necessarily draw attention to it include most of David Cage's games, with one extremely notable exception: the overwhelming majority of the Call of Duty franchise, and basically every single Pokemon game ever conceived. The Last of Us has a traditional structure extended over an elongated period of time, but its 12-hour runtime doesn't detract from the simplicity of that structure. In fact, I would say that it benefits greatly from it. The Last of Us is a simple, predictable story told extremely well by virtue of its great performances, its strong visuals, and its safe traditional 3-act structure. Its longer runtime simply gives it the tools it needs to massively extend the second act, where the characters spend most of their time developing as individuals and as a team. This is where its core strength comes from and why so many people are so fond of Joel and Ellie. The aim of the game is that by the conclusion, by the time Act 3 begins and you reach the hospital in Salt Lake City, you no longer want to part with Ellie or hand her over to the Fireflies, so when Joel rescues her you feel vindicated. You were right to feel that way. Your feelings have been validated and the game rewards you for it with an admittedly bittersweet but nonetheless excellent ending. I promise that this has a point, and I'm going to come back to it later in the video. It's important to understand just how easily The Last of Us works its narrative around an otherwise overused narrative structure to make it such an engaging and well-written story. And remember David Cage too, because sadly, I'm going to be coming back to him. So as you can imagine, when I say that one is a great game and one is mediocre, I'm referring specifically to the mechanics. Part 2 is far and away a more mechanically refined game with far more freedom of movement, much more to explore, and many more small, often insignificant but pleasing details. By virtue of being 7 years and another console generation ahead of its predecessor, it is also a much more beautiful, visually appealing game with some genuinely fantastic uses of dramatic lighting to amplify the tension and intended emotions of certain scenes. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it can be mesmerising. My problems with Part 2 don't stem from its visuals or its mechanics or anything like that. If anything, there are aspects of it that I greatly prefer over the original. Being able to distract nearby enemies with another faction, for example, luring a group of infected over to human enemies, causing them to begin fighting one another, allowing you to slip away silently. That is an excellent touch, and the first time I realised I could do it, I was honestly excited. I experimented with this mechanic a lot and never once had it fall against my favour. And this was something that either wasn't possible or wasn't considered in the original games. You would typically see groups of infected, then groups of humans, then infected again, rather than a combination of the two. And any time they were on screen together, it was often heavily scripted. These encounters in Part 2 are instead quite freeform, with you being able to duck in and out of combat at your leisure if you so desire, or simply watching from a distance and placing your bets. But before we dig too deeply into Part 2's flaws, I need a moment longer to collect my thoughts, and perhaps a friendly wall to bounce my tennis ball shaped ideas off.
God, I want to be nice, but I don't know how. What? It is not the best game ever known to man, in my opinion. But it's also not the shittest out there, and I just think it's so at the level. Actually, no, it's not at the level. It's a good game, but it fell short of the first one, and because it fell short of the first one, I guess I kind of don't want to hate it more than it deserves. I also don't want to like it more than it deserves either.
It's a solid 7 out of 10.
Yeah.
It's basically the epitome of a 7 out of 10, which is that the game itself, as in the gameplay and the mechanics, are great, and the visuals are absolutely drop dead gorgeous, but everything else is kind of It would be incredibly disingenuous of me not to talk about the game's marketing, because in all honesty, it is the only thing about this entire release and advertising campaign that legitimately pissed me off. The trailers for this game lie. There is no denying it. There are clips in many of the trailers that are deliberately altered from what actually appears in the game. This is nothing new. Trailers for games and movies do this constantly, with film trailers tending to feature scenes that end up not appearing in the final product at all. For a particularly egregious example of this, I have it on good authority that the Slender Man trailer featured a huge chunk of footage that never appeared in the theatrical film. The original teaser trailer for Uncharted 4 suggested a far darker game with Sam as the antagonist, a plot that was scrapped when Amy Hennig left Naughty Dog. Things often change during development and editing, but there's a difference between removing something and being deliberately misleading. What's disappointing about the Part 2 trailers isn't the fact that the footage isn't representative of the final game, it's that the footage was very clearly doctored to make it appear as though Joel survives far longer than he actually does. The most obvious example is this sequence seen here in the trailer.
What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Whereas in the actual game, it's Jesse who says this line.
What the hell are you doing here?
I think I'd let you do this on your own.
Jesse.
Where's Dina?
The Joel shown in this trailer is noticeably older and more haggard, akin to what his current day model looks like in the brief time that we have with him at the start of Part 2, which makes it very apparent that this is not a flashback, like much of the rest of the Joel and Ellie scenes are. It's clear that this was a very specific decision designed to reassure the audiences that their favourite angry old man wasn't going anywhere. This trailer was released before the majority of the game was leaked online, and I suspect that if the leaks had not happened, this sly little editing decision would have been quickly forgotten about. Instead, it was a point of serious but understandable contention in online discourse following the game's actual release, and the decision to do this only added more fuel to a roaring fire that exploded when the game was ultimately leaked. At this point in the timeline of Part 2's development and release, the game's original release date of February 2020 had already been pushed back to May before being delayed indefinitely in the wake of the world imploding more so than usual. When the leak struck, it did not take long for Sony to hurriedly slap a release date on the game, June of 2020, roughly a month after the leaks took place. Perhaps bending to pressure from Naughty Dog and fans who wanted to see the dissenters put in their place, or perhaps simply wishing to hurry the game out the door before it could inadvertently cause further damage. I won't speculate on which it was. When the leaks occurred, it was the breaking of a dam. The internet was flooded with hours upon hours of footage, from cutscenes to gameplay to what essentially amounted to the entirety of the game's prologue, along with the mid-game boss fight between Abby and Ellie, amongst other things. People were not impressed. Now, to preface before I go any further into this, I have very few limits when it comes to media. There are not many things that I won't watch, and I will often go out of my way to find things that others consider incredible, terrible, disgusting, reprehensible, whatever you want to call it, just to see how I react to it. I watched The Human Centipede somewhat out of obligation and found it mostly just kind of dull. My opinions on both The Witch and Hereditary are completely at odds with almost every other YouTube film review channel out there, although I will at least say I very much enjoyed Hereditary for the first 45 minutes or so. I'm a huge fan of horror in all shapes and sizes, and when it goes wrong I'm usually not surprised, but when it goes right you'll never hear the end of it. Horror is one of those feelings that is very difficult to do well, and much less do right. It's a very subjective feeling, of course, and while something like The Human Centipede will disgust people, for others it will evoke little more than a raised eyebrow. But horror doesn't have to be blood, guts and gore, or spooky ghosts doing spooky things, or lanky zombies poking holes in your barricades. It can be the slow, creeping dread of It Follows, or the discomfort and anxiety of the Blair Witch Project, or the existential terror of realising the utter meaninglessness of life. Much was made of the way that The Last of Us Part 2 was going to make you feel, how guilty you would be after killing your first guard dog, how their howls of anguish and the screams of their owners would be harrowing. Now, I am absolutely going to come across as heartless right now, so please bear with me so I can explain myself. I just don't care when it comes to dealing with canines in video games. I've had too many frustrating deaths at the hands of rampaging dogs in Demon's Souls, zombie Dobermans in Resident Evil, and every other angry canine in every other game where they can stun-lock you to death. Don't get me wrong, dogs are great when they're not trying to kill me, but there's a huge difference between the somber battle between the chosen undead and the great grey wolf Sif and this one random grumpy puppy in The Last of Us 2. There's a similarly big difference when the dog is a bundle of pixels that's trying to eat me compared to when the dog is my real-life lovable idiot whose unexpected decline in health happened so suddenly that there was no time to even process the thought of never seeing him again before he was gone. Context matters, and if an encounter with anyone or anything, dog or not, has been properly built up, then of course it's going to feel far more weighty and unsettling. It's the emotion behind the encounter that matters to me, and if that dog goes for my throat, I'm not going to feel guilty about finding a way to deal with it. That said, this article is a lie, and with every discovery of a new lie or a new mistruth or a new marketing ploy, those already predisposed towards despising this game only had more and more fuel for their bonfire. Fury over Joel's death, outrage at Abby's body shape, complaints about LGBT pandering, transgender characters, then the realisation that there was an embargo placed on reviews that prevented them from discussing the second half of the game, which in turn brought with it a fresh wave of speculation as to the overall quality of the game. Coupled with the frustration of what was perceived to be the unfair persecution of Joel, it wasn't long before the internet was in flames. Over the past decade or so, we've seen both the ire and the admiration of the gaming audience increase in fervour and fury as video games open up more and more avenues for storytelling, whether that's for better or for worse. But it has been quite some time, at least in my memory, that a game has caused such an enormous tsunami of hatred, vitriol and outrage over something so small. And that's not to say that the actions of certain other individuals is entirely in the right either. Troy Baker's infamous tweet, quoting Theodore Roosevelt in response to an otherwise untargeted comment by Jason Schreier about video games being too long, was flat out stupid. For posterity, I have no opinion on Schreier because the only thing I really know about him is that he apparently has a fair number of fingers in an equally fair number of pies. But it doesn't matter who it was that was offhandedly complaining in such a generic manner that video games are too long. Responding to that with a passive-aggressive quote that belittles the importance of criticism in the world of creativity isn't just tone-deaf, it comes across as dick-measuring. There is certainly fault on both sides, from willfully disingenuous marketing to online harassment. Still, there's one thing I shouldn't have to say, but I might as well throw it out there anyway. You should never, ever sink so low as to threaten the lives of those involved in the creation of a piece of media, no matter how you feel about that piece of media. There is no excuse for death threats, man, woman, child, whatever, threatening Laura Bailey and her family, her extremely young son, spreading insipid lies about the nature of the game's single-sex scene, targeting Druckmann for his heritage. This behaviour is pathetic, and in case anyone wants to argue with me again that the death threats weren't real, there's a link in the description to an interview with Laura Bailey regarding this exact matter. I'm not putting up screenshots of the tweets in question because nobody involved should ever be given a platform, no matter how minuscule. I've been playing video games for over 20 years, yet it's largely with the advent of social media and its accompanying anonymity that has given people the ability to dehumanise everyone else, to act in a way that most would never dare to do in real life. There is never an excuse for this behaviour. It is a video game. It is just a sodding video game.
I don't know. Do I just have extra compassion for people and always see the best in people?
It's funny because it's the lesson that Abby learns, but Ellie doesn't. Because, like, the whole, like you said, the whole, it's the whole, like, don't judge people because you don't know kind of thing, you know, everybody's just trying to survive. And, like, that's the lesson that Abby learns, and she learns it really quickly because she actively goes back to help Yara and Lev. But Ellie doesn't have a moment like that, and I could never really decide if they were trying to draw parallels between Joel and Ellie and Abby and Lev, because Lev is so underused that it just doesn't work.
I think it's because the game was simultaneously too long and not long enough.
Yes. Too much plot, not enough story. Diametrically opposing opinions swarmed the various subreddits, social media, and message boards. The dedicated subreddit for the game turned into a shit show, becoming a breeding ground for ire, whereas the original game subreddit maintained a relatively cordial approach to discourse. The game was review bombed to oblivion, reaching a low of a 3.4 user rating on Metacritic, and it sold over 4 million copies in its first weekend of release. So, what is my opinion on The Last of Us Part 2? I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's been months, several playthroughs, several discussions with my friends, and I still just don't know how I feel about this game. The remainder of this video is going to largely deal with coming to terms with that and perhaps trying to find a way to fall on one side of the fence or the other. But rather than just sit here and go on in various ways about why I don't know how I feel, let's just start by presenting the story of the game in a linear, unbiased manner. If you'd like to skip over this, there'll be a timestamp on screen to get to the first discussion point. We begin with Joel and Tommy discussing the events of the previous game, feeling very much like a previously on The Last of Us moment, as Joel restrings and tunes a guitar. Upon their return to Jackson, Joel brings the guitar to Ellie as a gift, performing a rendition of Pearl Jam's Future Days for her. It's evident that there is a gulf between them, and given how young Ellie looks, this likely takes place immediately after they return to Jackson at the end of the first game. A time skip occurs, and we now take control of Ellie getting ready to head out on a patrol. Along the way, she receives an apology from a man named Seth, who apparently insulted her the previous night, and discusses the day's planned events with Jessie, a friend. She comes across Dina, Jessie's ex and clear love interest for Ellie, who joins her on the journey, and together they make their way up through the mountains towards an approaching blizzard, ending up at an old hideout of a deceased friend, Eugene, where they share a joint and express their feelings for one another. Spliced into this are brief segments with an as-yet unnamed individual, Abby, who has travelled with a group of friends to Jackson to track someone down. It's clear that their intentions are insidious. In the middle of the night, Abby heads out by herself and is quickly noticed and chased by infected, but she's rescued by Joel and Tommy, who are struggling to get back to Jackson due to the blizzard and the horde. She invites them back to the old house that her group is staying in, and as they head inside and introduce themselves, Abby pulls out a shotgun and shoots Joel's leg. Tommy is knocked out, and Abby gets to work. For the next 10 to 15 hours you play as Ellie. She happens across the house after being split up from Dina and Jessie, and walks in just as Abby finishes off Joel. Although some of the crew want to kill Ellie as well, Abby deters them and the group knock her out instead before leaving. Sometime later, after being rescued by Dina and Jessie, Ellie and Dina make a brief stop at Joel's grave and collect a gun from his house, but are interrupted by Tommy's wife Marie, who tells them that Tommy has already left. Since the only lead they have points to Seattle, they are told to head there with the express order to bring Tommy back alive. On the outskirts of Seattle, old outposts are discovered, along with a locked gate that requires fuel to the generator before it can be opened. Ellie and Dina explore lower Seattle in search of fuel, coming across several locked buildings that can be looted, along with more information on the wolves, the group Joel's killer apparently belonged to. Regardless of whether or not you explore first, or simply head straight for the two buildings marked as supply depots, you make your way up to a hotel in Upper Seattle where the carnage indicates Tommy has already blazed through it. One of the corpses is a member of the group that participated in Joel's murder, one down. Ellie is knocked out by another member of the group and taken to a school that has been turned into a makeshift base. After a brief scuffle, she kills him. Ellie and Dina move on, ultimately coming across a decimated television station decorated with corpses, one of whom is another member of Abby's group. Although they manage to escape the station as members of the WLF descend upon them into the subway, eventually revealing her immunity to the cordyceps virus. With things tense between them, Ellie takes Dina to a nearby cinema, setting up a small camp where they start to track the movements of the wolves. Though not before Dina reveals her own secret: she's pregnant. The following morning, Ellie sets out alone to another part of the city in search of Abby's friend, Nora. There she comes across Jesse, who followed them to Seattle and has been raising hell until he found them. They journey together for a short while, but Ellie ultimately sends him back to Dina and continues alone, eventually tracking down Nora in a hospital locked in a battle with another gang of cultish individuals known as Seraphites, or Scars. She pursues Nora through the hospital and into the basement, trapping her at the end of a corridor with no hope of survival, already infected by the spores. Despite herself, Ellie beats Nora mercilessly until she reveals where Abby is hiding. In a flashback, we see that Ellie returned to the hospital in Utah and finds it long abandoned. Upon leaving, she finds Joel waiting for her and confronts him on what happened several years previously. At last, he tells her the truth and their relationship breaks down, Ellie heartbroken at the selfishness of his decision. She tells him that they are done and returns to Jackson. At last, Ellie makes her way with Jesse to the brink of Seattle Pier where they split up again, Jesse heading off to find Tommy, whilst Ellie continues on to Seattle's aquarium. Inside, she's attacked by a guard dog whom she kills and comes across two more members of the group, Mel and Owen, who are in the midst of arguing about leaving the city. Ellie tries to convince them to show her on a map where Abby has gone, but is briefly distracted and attacked. Owen is downed with a gut shot, and Ellie stabs Mel in the neck, but to her horror she realises that Mel is pregnant and it's too late to save her. At that moment, Tommy and Jesse arrive, taking her away from the aquarium and leaving her map behind. The group makes plans to leave and return to Jackson, but as they do so, they are attacked by Abby, who tracked them to the theatre. She shoots and kills Jesse, wounds Tommy, and turns the gun on Ellie, and we fade to black. 3 days previously, Abby is woken by a friend, Manny, with whom she travels from the WLF base in a converted stadium to the front lines of a war with the Seraphites, who have been increasing their attacks on the wolves, eventually reaching one of their forward operating bases. Here, the WLF leader, Isaac, tells her that Owen has gone missing and it's presumed that he turned on the group. He forbids her from heading out to find him, but with the assistance of her friends, Abby departs regardless. Briefly captured by the Seraphites, Abby is rescued by two Scars on the run, Lev and Yara, the latter of whom suffers a broken arm during the rescue. Although initially intent on leaving them to find Owen, Abby ultimately doubles back to help them out and offers to take Yara to the aquarium where Owen is hiding, where Mel will be able to help her with the injury. Once there, Mel informs her that the arm will need to be amputated, and so Abby and Lev follow a series of sky bridges across Seattle to reach the hospital and acquire medical supplies, with Lev opening up about the reason why he and Yara fled their island in the first place. Although Abby is briefly detained by the WLF as a runaway, Nora lets her go and sees her out, and Abby and Lev return to Mel with the medical supplies, ensuring the amputation is a success. Abby offers Lev and Yara a place on Owen's boat as they plan to sail to California to track down a new sect of the Fireflies. However, Mel bluntly states that she will not allow Abby to go. Throughout all of this, it's also revealed that the reason why Abby was trying to track down and kill Joel is because he murdered her father, the doctor at the operating table whom you were forced to kill in the first game. The following morning, Lev flees back to the Seraphite island, certain that he can change his mother's mind about his apparently sinful nature and convince her to leave with them, but is forced instead to kill her in self-defense. At the same time, a massive WLF attack on the Seraphite island sees an inferno rage throughout it. Abby, Lev and Yara are confronted by Isaac, and Yara is ultimately killed, although she takes Isaac down with her. In the chaos, Abby and Lev are able to escape and return to the aquarium, only to discover that Owen and Mel have been murdered. Lev finds the map, which indicates the theatre, and they make their way there to confront Ellie's group. The two threads converge, and Abby viciously beats both Ellie and Dina, but is stopped from killing them both by Lev's interruption. She agrees to leave, but demands that she never see Ellie again, lest she kill her. Sometime later, Ellie and Dina are raising Dina's child on a farm outside Jackson, although Ellie is suffering from PTSD after the events of the previous months. Tommy tries to convince her to go after Abby, having found new information on her whereabouts, and although Ellie initially refuses, she ultimately decides to leave and heads to Santa Barbara, their last known location. At the same time, we briefly control Abby as she and Lev investigate a house in Santa Barbara, but are captured by an unknown group after successful contact with the Fireflies. Ellie eventually reaches the base of the Rattlers, a sect within the city that captures people and infected alike, forcing them to fight for fun. She makes her way through the camp and discovers that Abby was previously imprisoned with the rest of the Rattlers' captives but has been punished for attempting to escape. She heads down to the beachfront to the rear of the base, where she finds both Abby and Lev strung up to poles and left to die. Although Ellie sets Abby free and only watches as she rescues Lev, when Abby attempts to leave by boat, Ellie refuses to let her go and demands that they fight. In the ensuing bout, Abby bites off 2 of Ellie's fingers, but in her weakened state is overpowered. However, Ellie cannot bring herself to finish off Abby, and so lets her go. She returns to the farm to find it abandoned, with the only belongings left being her own, including the guitar that Joel gifted to her. It's then that Ellie recalls her last conversation with Joel, the night before the events that led to his death, where she stated that she didn't think she could ever forgive him, but would like to try. Ellie attempts to play the guitar, but in the end, she leaves it behind in the farmhouse, and the game closes as we watch her through the upstairs window, leaving the house and its memories behind. It would be remiss of me not to mention a few minor issues the game has that aren't related to the story itself, as well as the things I did genuinely appreciate about it and the world. Let's start with the negative. Firstly, the setup of many of the game's combat situations feels heavily geared towards either expecting or outright making you kill everything in sight before you progress. One of the things I noticed happening throughout the game was that certain areas were guaranteed to spawn in extra enemies regardless of whether or not you'd alerted anyone else in the area, and regardless of whether anyone was there to begin with. A perfect example of this is the very first area where guard dogs are introduced. As you enter the area, a small number of guards are patrolling, and if you cut through them straight ahead without killing them and head around this house here, the next wave of enemies will spawn further away. However, if you instead enter the house and go to the basement, the enemies will spawn right outside the door, and one of them will always enter the basement through this door right here. This also happens even if you spawn the enemies by heading around the house, then double back and walk through the basement. It's extremely bizarre, as if the game has set patrol triggers that force enemies to appear in areas they shouldn't otherwise be in, simply because the game recognises that you are there. This is something I think of as the Outlast effect, and I've mentioned it in a lot of previous videos, that irritating game mechanic where the enemies technically don't know where you are, but because the game does, they will only roam around the area that you are in, rather than acting like normal human beings and fanning out again. This is the biggest reason why I've never finished Alien Isolation, and it is an extremely cheap way of forcing confrontation. But it's even more obnoxious when you've snuck through an area perfectly only to have some random twat pop up in your face because the game picked up that you were standing in an enemy spawn point. Why not just make it so that they only spawn and converge on you if you've been spotted, or if you've otherwise given literally any indication that you're there? It's incredibly immersion breaking when the only thing you've done thus far is waddle on your belly through the mud and try to hide in the house, only to have the enemies start patrolling the area you literally just walked into for no other reason than the game flagging your location. This happened in the original game too, and it's something that happens in a lot of action-adventure games, Uncharted being the perfect example. But the issue of enemies immediately spawning in the second you've been spotted still remains. I have no problem with enemies calling reinforcements, but what I do have a problem with is those reinforcements teleporting in from another dimension the moment my mate Fred over there happened to spot me. I'd greatly prefer that there be a system in place like the reinforcement from Far Cry's bases, for example, where a request is made to call for reinforcements, but if you manage to kill everyone else in the base before they arrive, the reinforcements have to actually look for you instead of magically knowing where you are. In a similar vein, it feels as though there's been no or very little accommodation for verticality with enemy lines of sight, perfectly encapsulated by this sequence where you split up with Jesse and have to steal the boat. There are enemies galore in this area and they all seem to have perfect 360-degree vision. Now, I'm obviously not saying that they should all have 1998 Metal Gear Solid cones of vision, but it's a little frustrating not being able to plan out a stealth route properly when the vertical axis of an enemy's vision isn't in the same stratosphere as the direction their eyes are actually pointing. The only upside to this is that the enemy's superb vision is at least consistent, meaning that even in pouring rain, smoke, darkness, fog and any other weather or lighting effect you may come across, they will have absolutely perfect vision and be able to pick you out from a mile away. Make of that what you will. During combat situations with Abby and the Seraphites, when you have either Yara or Lev with you, or on occasion both, it seems odd that there was no ability given to have them use the Seraphite whistles to misdirect your enemies. I can only guess that this wasn't included because it would make stealth as Abby a bit too easy, but it is a missed opportunity. It would have been fun to mess around with the scars that way. My last minor gripe with the game that isn't story related is one that really irritated me in repeat playthroughs. Despite the fact that Ellie is always carrying a knife, she isn't able to shiv clickers the way that Joel could in the original game if she gets grabbed. Being caught by a clicker, instant death. I'm not sure if they did this to show the difference between Ellie's preference for fast, lithe movements versus Joel's weighted, calculated beatdown of enemies, his pure brute force, as it were, versus her fast and light approach. But from a purely mechanical perspective, it's frustrating that Ellie kind of forgets she has a knife every time she gets grabbed. Moving on to more cheerful matters, there is a great deal of praise deserved for some of the smallest, most insignificant things in this game that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Like, for example, the dedication to properly representing the fingerwork during guitar practice. Ellie's hands form the correct chord alignments, pluck or strum the strings individually, and the bottom of the touchpad aligns to the low E string the way that tabs are traditionally laid out. It's such a small touch, but it's appreciated by this random musical stranger on the internet at least. Environmental details are also far more numerous, and by virtue of squeezing the absolute most out of the PS4 at the end of its life cycle, far more impressive than ever before. If you go for a swim, any items you have in your backpack, including any notes, will be soaked through and slowly dry out over time. But if you are only partially submerged, then those same items will only be slightly damp. Due to the game's larger scale, there are also far more instances of being able to follow a trail of notes to see what happened to various survivors around Seattle, greatly emphasised by the ability to bust in and root around inside a much larger and more varied number of shop fronts, cafes, and office buildings, to name but a few. In fact, one of the best moments in Ellie's half of the game happens in an apparently abandoned apartment building where, after a good chunk of the game spent in relative safety, whenever you interact with the weapon upgrade tables, you come across this one here and, well, it's such a neat little touch and it only happens once in the entire game, but it's a great example of a game's ability to suddenly and ruthlessly upend you in a moment that should have been saved. Granted, the illusion is a little bit ruined when you realise the guys who attack you are just hiding in this locked room, and you can upset the game's intentions of making you feel sorry for these runaway WLF soldiers by planting a bomb right outside the door, resulting in this. But still, it's a fun little moment in the game. Beyond this, there are so many other little moments in the game that, like the original, are engendered by exploration and encourage you to poke around in even the smallest of corners. If you take the time to thoroughly explore downtown Seattle during Ellie's day one, you can grab a shotgun at a very early point in the game, as well as find a few frantic notes from a group of thieves who attempted to rob the bank on Outbreak Day, which clearly went very well judging by this corpse. There's also the entire snowball fight sequence that lets you beat up children like a pro, or climbing up a model T-Rex and leaping off into a pool of very dirty water. That one safe that you can use the timeless code 0451 to open, famously referenced in every game from former Looking Glass Studios developers, BioShock and Deus Ex and well beyond. When breaking into the hospital as Ellie, you'll come across a WLF soldier playing Hotline Miami on a PS Vita, and in other parts of the game you can find Warhammer figures, a PS3 with a collection of Naughty Dog games. All of these things are Easter eggs, sure, but they're also miniature glimpses into the world of before, a world that Ellie has never known, and they serve as charming little moments as well as painful reminders of what's been lost. Although I could have done without that one videotape in Eugene's basement that apparently seems to be Crash Bandicoot porn. And this is not even touching on the game's visuals and in particular its performance. The Last of Us Part 2 performs impressively well, and whilst I played on a PS4 Pro, I understand from friends that it works pretty much perfectly on the original PS4 as well. Which is interesting considering that in my video on the first game I was critical of the fact that the game was extremely glitchy on release. By comparison, The Last of Us 2 is ridiculously smooth and gorgeous, squeezing absolutely every last drop of power out of the PS4. And as a result, it is largely bug-free. In fact, the only issue I had was right here whilst playing as Abby and Lev in the hotel. Lev got stuck at the top of this makeshift rope, the frame rate tanked, and Abby proceeded to then stroll around the lower floor by herself, having a conversation with a character who wasn't there and wasn't replying.
Oh man. Oh, I am so glad we took this shortcut. That's the joke, Lev.
So ridiculous and bizarre was this moment that I genuinely wasn't sure whether or not it was deliberate until Lev spontaneously popped back in once I reached the next area. But this was the only time in multiple playthroughs and many hours that I experienced any performance problems and glitches of any kind. And much like Ghost of Tsushima, this is very likely by virtue of the fact that the game was built from the ground up for the PS4. I'm no game developer, but I can imagine it's much easier to create an almost flawless experience when you only have the architecture of one console to worry about. This attention to detail is poured into almost every aspect of the game, from the simplest of things, like explosions causing guts and gore to temporarily splatter and stick to ceilings before slowly sliding off again, to the way that the screen blurs and staggers whenever you look down from a significant height as Abby. Blood will melt snow if you happen to get injured in one of those areas or shoot an enemy, and it will soak through bandages over time. And we're not even getting into the rope physics, which apparently took 3 people to achieve due to the complexity of the collision calculations, something most people won't notice, as just like Leon Hurley points out in this Games Radar article, most people won't acknowledge how difficult it is to animate rope physics since it just looks like a rope acting how it should. This same article also shows many things that I missed myself, click a breath showing in the cold, torches casting a different colour in the area if it's pointed at something with a strong hue, or how about the fact that there is a different animation for the stripping, cleaning and rebuilding of all the game's guns, as well as for each improvement you make to them, or safes making a different noise when you select the right number, meaning that with enough patience you can brute force the password for safes if you don't know it. Unlike in the original game where you had to know the password or the game simply wouldn't let you open it. And to think, a year prior we were all getting excited over horse balls shrivelling in the cold. When you have this many talented people working on any game that takes time to put daft little details into a game like this, regardless of whether or not most players will see it or even care, that level of dedication to your craft should always be appreciated. Whether that is Rockstar painstakingly animating the skinning of every animal in the American Midwest, or Naughty Dog bothering to properly animate Ellie putting things away in her backpack. This level of effort deserves to be credited, regardless of the other larger issues I have with the game. And unfortunately, all of these small details don't make up for the fact that the game does still have those deep wounding flaws. And it's time that we talked about those. I feel like it might be prudent to keep structuring this video the way that I have done so far, talking about the good before talking about the bad. In a way, I think this is because whilst the good is great, the bad is worse, and if I at least preface the discussion on the game's strongest issues, then it will feel far less like I'm tirelessly crushing the game's soul. Make no mistake, the game has soul, and in the right places, plenty of heart, so All things considered, I'm going to talk about those things that the game truly does very well. Much of this is the way that the action sequences interlink with the incredible environmental details, and there are no greater indicators of just what I mean than every section that takes place in any underground area, whether that be the multiple sections of the underground railways in Ellie's campaign or the hospital basement in Abby's campaign. Those moments where the game's stunning environments and lighting work together often create the strongest visual feasts in the game, on top of being teeth-grindingly intense. Indeed, these were amongst my favourite parts of the game despite their brevity. The chase to reach Nora as Ellie, or the sequence where Dina finally discovers that Ellie was telling the truth about being immune, the contrast of the red lighting from the flares versus the deep shadows is gorgeous. Any sequence where the game juxtaposes its beautiful environments and lighting is worth mentioning here, as they're often the most important sections of the game from a thematic perspective. Ellie's horror and panic as she realises Dina is about to sacrifice her own mask for her forces them both to confront the truth of her immunity. Abby slowly clawing her way across the sky bridges brings her face to face with her tremendous fear of heights and her accepting of there being far more important things at stake than her own ego. The parallels between the discovery of Tommy's rampage and the hotel, where the lighting is much softer to imply the gulf between Tommy's methods and Ellie's convictions, versus that of Ellie's rush through the hospital where she throws all inhibitions away to torture the information out of Nora. It's these moments where the mise-en-scène, or the construction of the scene, is at its most profound and powerful that the game actually succeeds in saying what it's trying to say. One thing I will bring up, albeit briefly, is the criticism of this game's thematic message and moral being something everybody knows and no one needs to hear again, that of violence begetting more violence, cycles of vengeance, and so on. And whilst it's true that this is nothing new, I will defend the game on this point, as citing this as a criticism is disingenuous at best. Many games in especially the past 10 years or so have dealt with themes of revenge in its cyclical nature, and it's rare that anyone complains about Shadow of Mordor or the entire Dishonored series or Assassin's Creed, Max Payne, God of War, Watch Dogs, Metal Gear or Sekiro, which isn't centred around it but certainly features themes of revenge because Genichiro was such a massive dick and I didn't need that arm anyway. Hell, even the ending of Red Dead Redemption echoed this sentiment in its final act, and if you want to get really nitpicky, New Vegas at least starts as a revenge story. British national treasure Stephen Fry famously said that an original idea can't be too hard, the library is full of them, and this is never more true than when the 25th trilogy to ride the coattails of Harry Potter's success was released and became a predictable mega-hit, or when the 43rd horror film remake is released and is a steaming pile of pants yet again. A piece of media treading a well-worn path doesn't inherently make it bad. Nobody except me was complaining about The Last of Us having a predictable story because it was incredibly well told, well paced and well acted. You might say that The Last of Us Part 2 beats you over the head with its themes, but for the most part, I don't feel that it does. The theme isn't the issue here and it never has been. The problem with recycling a theme isn't the recycling itself. It's entirely down to how well the story is told. Before we get into that though, I will throw a little more deserved praise the way of the actors. Every main character in the game, regardless of circumstance, is incredibly believable, nuanced and fantastically animated. Just as we've come to expect from Naughty Dog, the subtle facial animations, postures and just general attack, resting and other animations are, as always, phenomenal. There's no denying the amount of effort, care and attention poured into ensuring that these characters look and act real, regardless of whether you think they actually feel real. Ashley Johnson, Laura Bailey and Troy Baker, for how little screen time he ends up having, all do an outstanding job. Ashley's performance as young adult Ellie, who is still a child by many measures, battling her inner turmoil, her horror at what Joel has taken from her, whilst attempting to navigate the pressure of growing older and beginning a new relationship, is as rich and layered as you would expect. Her chemistry with Dina, played by Shannon Woodward, is incredibly well done, and their interactions typically feel realistic. Although they certainly do suffer from that traditional Naughty Dog style of writing where, a little like everything Joss Whedon has ever written, everyone has a hidden comedian within them and quips are sometimes a little bit too much. As another point of discussion, it is interesting that whilst the best parts of Abby's campaign are the explosive set pieces, the best parts of Ellie's are instead the quiet moments where she's with Joel. I suspect this might be at least partially the reason why many folks don't like Abby's inclusion in the game, since I can absolutely see why people might feel so much more effort went into her part of the story. Even people who don't like the game will be caught saying that Abby had the best parts of it: the hospital basement, the Skybridge sequence, the Seraphite village. These sections are all fantastic, and it's understandable that this would frustrate people. Since we're on the subject, we might as well talk a little more about these sequences. Like Uncharted before it, the game's use of set pieces is often just as exciting and intense as it is distracting in how jarring they can be. Unlike the set pieces of Uncharted 3, however, which Naughty Dog have already admitted to creating first and then weaving the narrative around them, in The Last of Us Part 2 it generally makes sense as to how you actually got there in the first place. The Seraphite Island, for example, is a set piece prompted by two interweaving side stories, one being Lev attempting to convince his mother to leave with them, and the other being the WLF's planned invasion of the island, both of which are discussed and foreshadowed beforehand. Similarly, when visiting the hospital as Ellie, you gather from the chaos left behind and the complaints of the WLF soldiers that something untoward has happened there, but since Ellie is so focused on finding Nora, she doesn't really notice. It is well managed to an extent just how often Ellie and Abby's paths cross before they actually come face to face, and it's a shame that you can only piece it together after you've played the entire game, but again, we'll get to that. I don't need to keep going on about how gorgeous these sequences are, but I will take a moment to discuss just how effective the hospital basement sequence is. The Rat King, as it has been dubbed, is set up so incredibly well that the moment you enter the area and see the mayhem it has left behind, causes the game's atmosphere to plummet into an intense, yawning void. This is an excellently designed section, or at least the build-up is, in much the same way that the build-up to the acid-spitting effect it is, highlighting just how well Naughty Dog can build tension when they actually try. And I say this because this area is somewhat reminiscent of the first time you come across a group of clickers in the original game, a section that I lambasted in my review and still don't really like to this day. Rather than just shoving you in a room with them, Part 2 instead slowly, effectively builds up that creeping intensity, bringing in one or two other enemies here and there to keep you on your toes, but not overemphasising the fact that something far worse is on the horizon. So when the Rat King actually bursts onto the scene in all his hideous glory, it is a wonderful moment, and the first thing that I received after my friend came across this lovely chap was a video of his appearance coupled with a horrified "What the fuck is that?" Well, I think I've put it off long enough now. Let's talk about what I think the actual issue with Part 2 is. So, remember when I said way back at the start of this video that there was one notable exception to David Cage's games having a typical 3-act structure? It's time to come back around to that. Beyond Two Souls is a narrative mess of a game that barely wants you to play it, but its biggest problem isn't even the fact that if you take a microsecond too long to make a choice it will simply make it for you. It's the fact that the game's structure is horrendous. Imagine if someone took all 3 Lord of the Rings films, combined them into one 12-hour-long epic, and then chopped them up into 20 to 30-minute segments, threw them into a metaphorical hat, then rearranged the movie based on whatever order they pulled the scenes out of said hat in. That is the problem with Beyond Two Souls. At its core, it has a traditional 3-act structure, but the way it is presented makes it extremely difficult to follow, and even more difficult to care about its characters and its plot. Now, ignoring the fact that David Cage very clearly wanted to make a movie, and ignoring the fact that his writing skills are, lackluster, the actual core plot of Beyond is not bad in and of itself. A young girl is raised in foster care, discovers she has a strange connection to a spiritual being who has powers of some kind, and has to learn to navigate life and the increasingly sinister company she's associated with as she grows up, eventually coming to realise that there are grander things at stake than her own existence. It's nothing terribly new, but the premise itself is fine. It's the execution of it that greatly harms the game, as you jump around between adult Jodie, child Jodie, and teenage Jodie having an angsty existential crisis, so you never really get to know who Jodie actually is. She's just a series of snapshots flung around in a wind tunnel, and with how wacky certain sections are, one minute she's a grumpy teenager, the next she's a highly trained CIA operative in some nondescript Middle Eastern/African country. This makes connecting to her on any level next to impossible. How am I supposed to feel about the relationship between Jodie and her boyfriend kind of sort of dude person man thing when the first scene shows that she hates him and the next scene she's setting up a dinner for him? Goddamn Gollum over here, I swear to Christ. Part 2 is nowhere near as messy as Beyond Two Souls, but the comparison is apt because the biggest issue with The Last of Us Part 2 is its structure. Just to refresh everyone's memory, because I know we've been here a while and some of you have probably fallen asleep, but the structure of the game is this. The intro, in which you swap between Ellie and Abby, Day 1, Day 2 and Day 3 as Ellie, followed by Day 1, Day 2 and Day 3 as Abby, followed by the farm as Ellie, Santa Barbara as Abby, and finally Santa Barbara as Ellie. Like the first game, Part 2 has a 3-act structure. Unlike the first game, however, Part 2 has a 3-act structure split into 2 3-act structures and bookended by an extended intro and outro. The problem with structuring the game this way is that you already know what's going to happen, so there are no stakes. The only thing you want to do is get back to the standoff at the theatre, so there's no reason to care about the rest of the cast surrounding Abby because they're all already dead. Why shouldn't I just rush through her campaign to reach the theatre again? What's the value in listening to all these people talk at me for 10 hours if they're all just going to be dead again? This is a long game. My first playthrough took around 30 hours, which is over twice the length of the original game, and it definitely feels it. The game starts to drag once you reach the farm, and I genuinely expected it to end there. So when it didn't, I started to wonder how much longer it was going to go on for, and when I reached the Rattler base, I was fed up. Not just because the game should have ended hours ago, but because of how it was choosing to wrap up its story. Being long isn't inherently an issue. Hell, I always thought the first game was long, relatively speaking, for a single-player game in the early 2010s, after years of single-player campaigns fluctuating between 4 and 8 hours at best. But it has to be compelling and it has to be able to hold your attention, and once Day 3 as Abby is over, I feel it doesn't do enough to keep me invested. There are a couple of reasons for this, but primarily this is caused by the introduction of the Rattlers. I am so sick of media suggesting that all humans are inherently evil, terrible people, that no one will ever do anything good, that every time groups of people get together they will immediately become absolute bastards. The Walking Dead did this constantly, and it is one of the reasons why I stopped watching it. The original game does this, but it's generally always the same group of people who try to kill you, and it's offset by the fact that the Fireflies were actually trying to do the right thing. Every post-apocalyptic story is absolutely enamoured with people being horrific beasts who are the real problem, and I understand that. I mean, hell, just look at the world without an apocalypse. But The Last of Us Part 2 really exacerbates this problem and takes it to its absolute limit. Every single faction in this game, with the exception of Jackson, is disgusting, inhumane and preoccupied with doing terrible things to everyone not in their specific group. Don't get me wrong, I know humans are capable of terrible things, but they're also capable of great things too. The UK's annual Children in Need event smashes its last charity total by a country mile almost every year, raising tens of millions for the disadvantaged, disabled and poverty-stricken children of our nation. There are many, many families in this country that rely on local charities, who in turn rely on the donations of our own people when the government refuses to keep them afloat. People are generally empathetic to the point where it's considered abnormal to not care in some capacity for your fellow humans. We share stories, lives, and whilst it's not always with the best of intentions, it's rarer still that it's with the worst. I just wish that they had done something else here. I would have taken an empty stadium. I would have taken Abby sitting on a deck chair on a beach living the high life. Anything but just another generic group of arseholes with nothing better to do than be sadistic. The game is almost relentlessly miserable, but this never really bothered me until 2 specific points. The Rattlers, which was more of an irritation than anything, and the boss fight between Abby and Ellie at the midway point of the game. This boss fight is unpleasant. Not in the sense that it's bad, it's highly reminiscent of the David fight from the original, which is an extremely bizarre juxtaposition to make considering that David was an evil son of a gun who was strongly implied to be on the cusp of a very different kind of assault before Ellie managed to kill him. And this wouldn't be an issue if it weren't for the fact that Ellie is the one on the receiving end of the punishment. Playing this fight as Abby is unpleasant because whilst they're somewhat similar in age, it's never really clarified how old Abby actually is, Abby is built like a brick shithouse. She is twice and then some the size of Ellie, and it's just not a contest. It's unpleasant because not only is watching somebody beat the shit out of a young, relatively fragile girl who is still a child unpleasant, it's deeply so when you're made to participate in it. It wouldn't matter who was on the receiving end of this beatdown, whether it was Ellie, Dina, Lev, anyone who is far less physically imposing than Abby, it would be horrible regardless, because the target is a small, weak child. And I suspect Naughty Dog knew this was a horrible fight because they take your weapons away and leave you with only your fists. In fact, I thought I was meant to lose at this part the first time I played it because it seemed so unreasonable that the game would go on any longer and that they would expect me to beat up Ellie, so I let myself die and was horrified when I respawned. This is the one and only time that I would agree that the game tries to force its message down your throat, but the fight itself didn't need to be this way. It can be fixed extremely easily, just have you play the fight as Ellie and lose. That's all you needed to do. It's impossible to empathise with Abby in this situation because it's very clear that no matter how much firepower Ellie has, the moment the gap between them is closed, she's finished. It didn't need to be this way, and it disgusts me that this is what made it into the final game. I understand what they were getting at, but they went about it all wrong, and this is endemic of the wider problem with the game. As I said before, the structure massively takes away from any attempt you have to empathise with Abby and her friends due to the fact that all the people she is with are already dead by the time we take over as her. We know how they die, when, and by whom. Connecting with them is pointless because we're not going to feel anything when we see them die or when we see them as corpses when we are actually playing as Abby. And it's made even more bizarre by the fact that everything else as Abby is great. Lev and Yara are interesting characters, and whilst they're not necessarily made the most of, something I'll get into in a moment, they are easily the best parts of Abby's campaign simply because we don't know how it's going to play. It's easy to get invested in a story when you're starting from scratch. It baffles me that Naughty Dog chose to go with this structure for the final product. That being said, I'm not entirely sure this was a decision made out of creative intention so much as it was one made out of concern. And what I mean by that is that I genuinely believe that the original intention was to have you play as Abby first, after Joel's death. And before I proceed, I should probably answer one of the last few questions I'm sure people have. How do I personally feel about Joel's death? And my honest answer is that I don't care. I never connected to Joel in the first game. I said it in my video that when I first played, I wanted to be given the choice to sacrifice Ellie at the end of the game, and whilst I do appreciate and understand his journey, that doesn't mean I care about him as a character. I relate far more to Ellie than I ever will to Joel, which is probably why I feel so much more strongly about the Abby versus Ellie boss fight than I ever will about Abby going golfing with her friends. Let me say something inflammatory, since I suspect that anyone who was going to dislike this video is probably long gone by now. Joel deserved to die. I'm not saying he necessarily had to die, but did his actions in the first game warrant Abby's revenge? Absolutely. Joel killed a hell of a lot of people. He murdered Marlene in cold blood as she was surrendering. She was not fighting, she was trying to make him see reason, and he shot her in the gut. And then when she was bleeding out and begging for her life, he shot her in the head. Tess has to remind Joel that they're shitty people. It's been that way for a long time.
Guess what? We're shitty people, Joel. It's been that way for a long time.
No, we are survivors.
This is our chance.
It is over, Tess!
And when Joel and Ellie first arrive in Pittsburgh, he tells her that he knows the bandit setup of feigning an injury well, because he's been on both sides of it before. Hell, didn't I even say, originally, that I was frustrated by the fact that you were forced to kill the doctor in the surgery? The doctor who turned out to be Abby's father? Because this whole game would never have happened without that forced death. I had always assumed that Joel or Ellie would die to make a second game happen at all, because what other stakes were there? There was no other reason for either of them to ever leave Jackson again unless something horrific happened to them. Whether that be Jackson coming under attack and one of them dying in the crossfire, or something like exactly what we got, and since Ellie is still young and immune, it would have made little sense to kill her off. I always expected Joel to die, so the fact that he did never once bothered me. It was visceral, it was gruesome, and it was deserved. He brought it on himself. However, Joel's death as the catalyst comes far too early in the story. I have a few ideas on how this could have been done better, from moving around parts of the story to rewriting some sections entirely. So this brings us to one final question. How would I fix The Last of Us Part 2? There are a couple of ways I would change both the structure and the story of this game to make it a little more coherent, to make it easier to empathise with Abby's cast of characters, or just to tidy up the game in general. To make this easier to parse, we'll start by just suggesting some structural amendments to the game that we actually got. So as we discussed earlier, it does feel like the game was originally meant to have you primarily play as Abby in its opening sections, and if you restructure the game this way, I feel like it flows a lot better. You don't already know what's going to happen, you get to know the characters, and as a result, you're much more likely to feel worse about Owen and Mel's deaths. For example, by the time you get to that point as Ellie. With that in mind, a possible restructure of the game could be: keep the introduction the same. It works well and is structured in a sensible way that suits its increasing pace. There would be no need to swap out any section for another character, even with the slight jarring halt of Dina and Ellie getting their rocks off. Proceed with the aftermath of Joel's death as normal until Ellie leaves Jackson. After this point, it would make sense to play as Abby immediately and complete at least Day 1 and Day 2 as her. This gives us time to calm down after Joel's death, warm to the characters, understand their motivations, and come to accept being in Abby's shoes. It takes far too long in the game for Abby's father to be revealed as the doctor that Joel killed, owing to the fact that you play as Ellie for so long. So having this be brought up far earlier in the structure will make it easier for players to empathise with her. Once you reach the end of Day 2 as Abby, we revert back to Ellie, play through Day 1 and Day 2 as Ellie, and then proceed with Day 3 until she leaves for the aquarium, at which point we should start to show the parallels between the sudden snappy pacing of the introduction and this climactic build-up as Ellie closes in on Abby. We should swap back to Abby until the end of the Haven section, control Ellie as she finds and kills Owen and Mel, then only show Abby finding them and tracking Ellie to the theatre. Importantly, play the boss fight as Ellie and lose. Following this, the game can proceed as normal. It's very likely that Naughty Dog realised and accepted the fact that players would not want to play as Abby right after Joel's death, but the current structure absolutely kills the pacing of the game. If they had instead gone with their gut instead of their head, they would have avoided a backlash against the review embargo that was placed on the latter half of the game, and it's far more likely that people would have grown to at least appreciate Abby's half of the narrative, even if they didn't like her as a character. Obviously I can't guarantee this and we'll never know, but this is the more speculative part of the video, so what can I do but wish for something better? Another method could have been this. Market this as an entirely new story in the same universe with Abby as the main character. Have you play through the game from Day 1 as Abby all the way up to Day 3 and her approaching the theatre, without ever explaining who it is that's chasing after her. Then revert back to Ellie, play the introduction and reveal Joel's death, play through the days as Ellie, and end the game at the theatre with them understanding one another and parting ways relatively amicably. If you must proceed with the slightly irritating ending, then that can be tacked on as well. It's not necessarily a given, and I would prefer that we ended in the farmhouse with Dina and Ellie together, but Ellie's still haunted by what had happened, and learning to live with herself a different way. Honestly, I just want the rattlers gone from this game. Before I talk about how I would actually amend the story, I do want to just point out that if I had to keep the story and structure the same and only add to the game to improve it, I would have at the very least included some actual exploration of how certain deaths impact the characters. The strongest example of this is Jesse's death, which is so sudden and so superfluous that it feels like somebody just decided right before the game went gold to kill him off then and there. We never see how his death impacts Dina, who is literally carrying his child, for God's sake, and the only mention of his passing is briefly brought up when Dina talks about Jesse's parents helping them out. It's so nonchalant it might as well have never been brought up at all, and it frustrates me because it feels like such a disservice to his character, and especially considering that Tommy also gets blasted in the face but survives. Furthermore, I would also actually bother to explore how his mother and sister's deaths affect Lev. For Christ's sakes, game, he killed his own mother. Once it happens, that's it. It's never brought up again, nothing is made of it, and Yara is killed off almost immediately afterwards. By the time you reach Santa Barbara as Abby, Lev seems like a perfectly normal, well-adjusted individual, which just doesn't feel right after the hellscape of his entire way of life crumbles around him in a literal inferno. Hell, after Abby and Lev find out about the Fireflies, Lev has nothing else to do for the rest of the game and is just a prop that Ellie uses to force Abby to fight her. Just like Jesse, it feels like Lev is criminally underused, and when his final part in the game is just a set dressing, he may as well have never been included at all. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that he should have died on the island as well, because any attempt the game makes to draw parallels between Abby and Lev to Joel and Ellie in the first game falls completely flat when you remember that Ellie had already lost everyone she cared about before the game even began. The two are nowhere near comparable. Finally, there is no payoff for Isaac at all. He's talked about throughout Abby's campaign, but then we meet him once, he is supposed to be ominous and scary, and then he just dies like an idiot at the hands of the girl he just gunned down. It's utterly unremarkable and pathetic, and feels like he was literally only written in to give a reason as to why Yara should die. But then because the game doesn't do anything with Yara's death, it's an utter waste of any potential he may have had. It does feel as though his role was meant to be bigger but was cut down to save time. Whilst the focus on Abby and Ellie does work for the most part, the decision to ignore the potential its side characters have just highlights the deep flaws that the game already has. If you aren't going to do anything interesting with the characters you created, then why bother adding them in the first place? To fix the game's problems entirely is a phrase that requires some serious hubris from myself, but let's just pretend that I'm a top dollar Naughty Dog employee for a moment and not just some random dickhead on the internet. And this is of course going to be heavily biased because there are aspects of the game that I like that other people may not. So instead I'll just go through one more way that the death of Joel as a catalyst could have worked better, and perhaps present the game that I would have wanted and was expected to begin with. In that initial reveal trailer, where Ellie tells Joel that she will kill every last one of them, whilst it is relevant to the current story, it could be interpreted in a different way. If you then consider the second trailer in which we see the party that prompted Ellie and Dina's first kiss. When I saw these trailers, I immediately expected that the game would be about Ellie seeking revenge for an attack on Jackson. So here is my last suggestion on how to fix the game whilst keeping the general structure and themes presented in the final product. We begin in media res, already in Seattle with Dina. Conversations suggest that they were asked not to leave and that something terrible happened, but we're not told exactly what. Nobody wants to talk about it, understandable, it must have been something awful. We're given flashbacks to other interactions, Jesse getting to know him, finding out that he is Dina's ex. We see that Ellie and Dina are growing closer, but it becomes clear that Dina wants revenge, although Ellie isn't quite sure that the level of determination she has is relative, until she discovers that Dina is pregnant and Jesse is the child's father. At some point it's revealed that the town was attacked during the very same party where Dina and Ellie kissed, by a group of renegade WLF soldiers who were there searching for Joel and called for him to be handed over to prevent anyone else being hurt. But when the town refused, a firefight broke out and several people, including Jesse, were killed in the ensuing chaos. Joel and Tommy catch up with the girls, determined to take them home, but Ellie is committed to Dina's plight and vows to help her see revenge for Jesse's death. Tommy stays behind to help Dina track the WLF's movements, whilst Ellie and Joel head out to track down each member of the group that attacked Jackson. More details are unveiled, and we also learn Joel and Ellie have their own problems, with it being clear that Ellie is struggling to connect to him the way she once did. As they proceed with tracking down and neutralising each member of the group, they are unexpectedly separated, and a confrontation with Abby, Owen, Mel and Nora occurs, wherein Joel is recognised. Sometime later, Ellie finally comes across Joel beaten almost to death and witnesses the final blow before the group leaves, satisfied. Caught up in one act of vengeance, she sinks deeper into an extreme and relentless rage, and with Tommy and Dina's help, she tracks down and slaughters each member of the group, until the conflict with Owen and Mel at the aquarium. Upon realising that Mel is pregnant as she lies dying, and with the fresh knowledge of why Abby wanted Joel dead, Ellie flees back to the theatre, intent on returning to Jackson and terrified of the person she is becoming. However, Abby is incensed by their deaths, and so tracks her down again. The two fight, but Abby is weakened by emotion and Ellie is weakened by the horror of her actions. Neither has the heart to continue any longer, realising that all they are doing is perpetuating the violence of those they once looked up to. With one of them fearing for the future of the child they'll be raising and the other accepting that her choices led to the deaths of those she cared about, they part with the agreement that they will never see one another again. Sometime later, Ellie is living at the farm with Dina and her newborn. She still suffers from nightmares at what she witnessed and the violence she committed, but with the help of those she loves, she learns to let go. She spends some time with Joel's guitar and begins to play the Pearl Jam song he once played for her. In Santa Barbara, Abby finally tracks down the house that Owen once mentioned as being a possible Fireflies base. She finds it abandoned but tries the radio regardless, with no response. It is then revealed that her father was the doctor who was supposed to operate on Ellie, but was mercilessly killed by Joel in flashback. She understands why he did it, but the anger still begins to take command of her again. Abby turns to leave, but as she does, the radio bursts into life and the Fireflies respond to her call. She pauses, unsure of which direction she wishes to head in. We fade to black as she presses a switch to reply. Just how much fat did I trim from the game to get that narrative to flow? So much. No Seraphites, no Isaac, no turf war, no worthless death of Jesse, no punishment for Tommy, no disgusting unpleasant boss fight between a pro wrestler and a child. Yara and Lev are not underused because they don't exist at all. The stronger focus on Abby and Ellie would have worked so much better if all of the faff and fluff from the current game was removed entirely. And I would have greatly preferred if Abby had just gone and found the Fireflies at the end. Each of them is looking for something to help them ease the pain of loss and the regret of revenge, but the game that we got never really addresses just how one moves on. Just that violence will always beget violence, and whilst that's not a bad thing, I would have preferred literally anything over the goddamn Rattlers. Yes, I know I'm hung up on the Rattlers, but they are genuinely the worst part of the game for me, and they feel so crowbarred in that it entirely derails any sense of tension as Ellie tracks down Abby one last time. And I didn't even talk about how it is literally impossible to bite off someone's fingers. In all honesty, I think that the game that we got in the end only suffers as a result of those two things, structure and lack of commitment to its characters. With a little more build-up of those things, and a little bit more of a restructure, I do genuinely feel most people would have been far more receptive to its themes and its narrative. Because everything else is almost pitch perfect, that gorgeous lighting, the beautiful visuals, the far more open-ended gameplay, the outstanding attention to detail, it's all there. The ingredients are here to make it as flawless a game as anyone could manage. They've just been sidetracked by an emphasis in all the wrong places. All the way back at the start of this behemoth of a script, I mentioned in passing that I would like to use this as an opportunity to decide or understand whether or not I like this game. And in writing this monstrosity, I've come to the conclusion that, yeah, I actually do. Of course it could be improved. The game missed opportunities to better explore the human psychology and make better use of its many, many characters. And having such a large cast was always going to make it difficult to get players to connect with all of them without huge sacrifices being made along the way. Especially when taking into account that the reason why the first game worked so well was because the story was so strongly focused on Joel and Ellie. Though there were side characters, their stories were always properly finished before they were left behind. Even so, I realise now that as we draw to a close, I had far more positive things to say about this game than I thought I did. And originally I even wrote a line that said most of the video would be criticism. But as it turns out, that just wasn't true. So much of my criticisms hinge on the fact that the game's structure is its biggest flaw, that it makes it very easy to ignore just how much of the game is actually incredibly well made. Like I said earlier, all of the pieces for a perfect experience are there, They've just been scrambled to high heaven. It's also easy to get hung up on what should have been rather than what is, and whilst I'm sure there's a metaphor in that phrase somewhere that would parallel the themes of the game, this has gone on long enough now. So thank you for watching, Happy New Year, and please, stay safe.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.